All right, welcome back, everyone. We're here for our final session, session 5, and we will be hearing from, I believe, 3 different presenters or panelists, and we should go ahead and get started so we stay on time. So we're going to start with Melinda Box and Maria Gallardo Williams from North Carolina State University, Department of Chemistry. And I think it's interesting that they will be talking about transparency and the relationship between transparency, safety culture, and not creating, and then how creating the conditions are in line with our concerns about ethical issues. So I will invite them to take the screen. I think, are you muted?
Okay.
There we go. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And we want to thank the conference here for having us. And thank you for joining us for the presentation. In it, we would like to share our experiences as we were introduced in using teachable moments and positive feedback in particular to generate a culture of transparency. And with it, a culture of safety. I'm Melinda Box. I'm the Chemistry Department Safety Officer at North Carolina State University. My background and training includes a bachelor's degree in chemistry, master's in science education, and 3 decades of experience in college-level chemical education with particular focus on lab instruction and curriculum development. My co-authors are Sienna Pei, who is an undergraduate assistant in our organic chemistry lab program, and who was also introduced Maria Gallardo Williams, who is the director of the organic chemistry lab program, where I also work as the stockroom supervisor. In the other half of my position as the safety officer, I have observed significant changes in engagement and safety compliance over the past 4 years, following the inclusion of positive feedback in environmental health and safety inspections and active efforts to turn teachable moments into occasions of learning. Inspired by this, we've assembled in this presentation principles of evaluation tool design, organizational management, educational practice, and behavioral psychology to help explain what we observed. So in our experience of developing a culture of safety, we found that it required extending organizational interests beyond the limits of legal requirements and into the realm of ethical concerns. Thus, we encountered the same need for transparency in growing a culture of safety that's essential in establishing a culture of ethics. So in the realm of safety, what kind of transparency did we strive for? At 2 ends of the safety compliance spectrum are, on one end, knowledgeable safety professionals plus practitioners. At the other end are practitioners applying their own safety knowledge. The advantage of the former, of course, is the power of specialization and professional focus. And the advantage of the latter is self-regulation, meaning that those who are taking the risks have sufficient knowledge to safely manage them. The latter is an important component of developing a culture of safety. In that approach, instead of delegating responsibility for safety oversight to specialists, it's expected that all workers will be informed and will sufficiently self-monitor. To achieve that, transparency is key so that worker needs can be promptly identified, freely communicated, and reasonably addressed. So, what is a teachable moment? It's a circumstance of intense interest caused by need, doubt, and/or uncertainty, which as a result is both vulnerable and valuable. These moments are pivotal because they can generate both protectiveness and a strong desire to learn. Therefore, if inclinations to hide, blame, or defend are met with demonstrations of social safety and suitable information, recipients hungry for solutions can promptly incorporate those into their understanding with an amplified appreciation for the context in which they apply. So how do you know if a moment might be a teachable one? In general, these moments are circumstances of discovering deficiency. For example, when one gets caught. While that's generally not considered desirable, it can be an opportunity to convey social safety, Letting others know that they have help and support in making needed changes can lead to recipients learning about why those changes are needed and how to make them. Confusion is also a state of deficiency. As a result, expressing it may be avoided, particularly in the lab safety setting, where doing so may imply pre-existing conditions of non-compliance or even worse, skeptical resistance. On the other hand, if this confusion is met with listening and emotional support, then recipients may feel freer to ask more questions and thereby leverage their confusion to get the input they most need when they are most interested in it. And lastly, concern can be a state of recognizing another's deficiency in some sense. To further explain, expressing uncertainty about work conditions can risk institutional defensiveness. However, if this is met with openness and curiosity, this apprehension can be leveraged to mutual gains and wider understanding of systems, practices, and priorities. In addition, meeting these concern-based needs can lead to recipients reciprocating with an amplified commitment to compliance. From another angle, one might also recognize a teachable moment by staying alert to temptations related to finding these deficiencies. Examples include feeling victorious in finding errors, feeling superior in demonstrating personal knowledge, or feeling determined to quash defiance. Unfortunately, pursuing those types of approaches evokes compliance by fear rather than by understanding, and so misses out on the benefits of a teachable moment. So how do you optimize a teachable moment? It begins with ethical listening. This involves taking in a speaker's message with an open mind, meaning being able to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly without prejudgment or mental counter-argument. This approach to listening is central to demonstrating and cultivating the openness necessary for optimizing a teachable moment. As a result, turning a teachable moment into an occasion of learning begins with instruction, not of the evaluee, but of the evaluator. To be certain that knowledge supplied is meaningful, the evaluator must have a complete picture of the context. To obtain that, the evaluator must openly show deficiencies in knowledge by demonstrating curiosity. The evaluator must also demonstrate openness to input from multiple sources by pursuing conversation, and must demonstrate openness to new perspective by working to imagine what it would be like to do the same task with the same resources in the same space. So how have we leveraged teachable moments here at NC State? In the Chem department in 2017, we began an initiative of documenting incidents in a lessons learned format. These memos provide anonymized accounts followed by a summary of what went right, what went wrong, and what preventative measures could be taken. These are compiled with the input of those involved in the incidents and are shared via email with all members of the department. An example of a lessons learned memo and the process of generating it are provided as a handout. I think it was provided as a link. And the title of that handout is Mental Health in the Time of COVID. So I chose an occasion that might be more universally identifiable than just chemistry itself. In addition, more memos are available on the NCSU Chem Department Safety Resources webpage, and more case studies are available in the ACS Chemical Health and Safety article, Creating a Positive Community-Based Learning Environment in a Chemistry Department. In a completely other realm, we have also initiated provision of regular positive feedback with annual lab inspection reports. Provided as a supplement to standard checklist results, this feedback is delivered by email to the safety rep and the PI for each research group, as well as to department administration. The results we have observed were a noticeable improvement in the first year and an additional improvement in the following year. So to explain what we observed about giving positive feedback, one review article titled "Bad is Stronger Than Good" found that in almost every way, bad experiences left a stronger impression than good ones, with one exception: the content of feedback. It turned out that people would not remember negative feedback content as well when it was accompanied by sufficient and meaningful positive feedback. So how much positive feedback is needed? In the original study, they observed a significant increase in recall of negative feedback when a fixed ratio of approximately 3 positive comments to 1 negative comment was studied.
Mhm.
Additional support was found by team studying workplace team performance. In that case, it was observed that in high-performing teams, 5.6 positive comments were exchanged for every 1 negative, whereas in performing teams, there were 1.9 positive comments for each negative, and in low-performing teams, the ratio became less than 1, with more negative comments exchanged than positive ones. So why is positive feedback so important? Evaluation tool design and organizational management principles explain this in several ways. First, positive feedback establishes trust and rapport between the giver and the receiver. This not only builds teams, as in the previously mentioned study, but in the case of any evaluation, it facilitates revelation. To elaborate, if recipients' strengths have been acknowledged, they feel an added sense of security, and this security can contribute to revealing more about their work conditions and practices. This added security also amplifies their confidence to build on their existing strengths. In other words, it empowers them to perform at a higher level. Second, it conveys to recipients acknowledgement of how they are achieving excellence, and by association, what they are doing correctly that they need to keep on doing. Third, it acknowledges what is often most valuable and meaningful to the recipient, that is, whether or not they succeeded at something that they were striving for. So how does giving positive feedback cultivate transparency? Psychological studies have shown that negative feedback encourages adherence to standards, but also reduces variation in behavioral responses. By contrast, behavioral studies have shown that positive feedback expands the spectrum of responses. With it, the perceived risk of punishment is lower, and so people try new things. They become more open to learning and become more engaged with others and with the effort. They are more secure to reveal ignorance and deficiency, and so demonstrate greater transparency. The impact of positive feedback then is so significant that waiting until the spontaneous urge to record it develops may not be the best strategy. Instead, making an active effort to identify the conditions and actions that are praiseworthy can ensure that the benefits of positive feedback are not missed. This effort can be made in formal inspections, incident investigations, as previously mentioned, and in daily informal contact. To additionally ensure that the benefits of positive feedback are not lost, it's important to make sure, of course, that the feedback is sincere, meaningful, timely, and specific. So in other words, not just good job, go into detail. All right, so to sum up, if we can turn teachable moments into occasions of learning, then we can help recipients make significant gains in the contextual knowledge they need for self-evaluation. By the same token, we can also help them build the confidence they need for self-revelation by noting their successes and allowing them to shine. Subsequently, when external evaluation is invited, transparency is achieved, and the collective will therefore have the tools it needs to grow in exercising ethical consideration and grow in their culture of safety. So that's the sum of our 2 initiatives and what we found supported what we observed. And welcome any questions or inquiries or insights from others. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Melinda. All right, if there are no clarifying questions, I think we'll go ahead and move on to the second panelist. Any clarifying questions? All right. Okay, thank you again. Next, we're going to hear from Alexandra Bradner and Rebecca Bates, Kenyon College in Mankato State in Minnesota. And they are ready. Great, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Well, thank you to the presenters for giving us information about all these exciting projects, and to the organizers for creating a space for people to share ideas. I'm a philosopher of science, and Becky is the chair of the Department of Integrated Engineering. So we had a meeting of the minds of a philosopher and an engineer. This is a presentation about developing an ethics credential, but it really in the end is a presentation about developing pathways between faculty members from the more ethical side of these questions and the more STEM side of these questions. We're gonna set up the project conceptually, and then we're gonna give you a little bit of a sample of what we've done and talk about assessment, and that will be it. In the chat, I've put a link to one of our sample modules, and if you could navigate to that link and just have it handy, it might be helpful later in the presentation. You don't need to do that, but if you do, I think it'll be more concrete for you. Thanks. So next slide. Yeah. So science opens up possibilities. It innovates and it gives us new things to think about. Next slide. But it doesn't really tell us what to do with those possibilities. Science can be descriptive, where philosophy can be normative. And this is an exploration, this whole workshop really that you've organized is an exploration in how to bring these more normative methodologies and more normative ways of thinking to a discipline that sometimes is exclusively descriptive. All right, next slide. So this is the challenge that we were faced with. So of course, we want our learners to know the social impact of their work and how to communicate. And importantly, throughout their careers, STEM learners have to make very high stakes personal choices. Where should they work? What topics should they pursue? But adding ethical content to a STEM course requires a major learning curve for a faculty member. So our question was, what could we do to support STEM faculty in bringing in these new methodologies, this new content into their courses? Next slide. So Becky and I met last fall in the STEM Futures Project, which was a month-long workshop sponsored by the NSF to encourage people to develop all kinds of things, assignments, curricular plans, extra co-curricular activities that would expand the instruction of STEM to go beyond traditional STEM content to some of these more humanistic disciplines. So it was a design sprint. So they gave us 3 constraints. And those 3 constraints were, of course, you had to bring more humanistic knowledge into STEM with your product. We were developing products. Secondly, you had to attend to all of the latest metacognitive research. So we were to think about student-centered learning, active learning, ways to foster creativity and imagination within STEM. And the 3rd constraint was, don't lose any of the content. Keep your eye on the prize, which is that the point of an intro chem course is to teach chemistry. And we want to bring these new things into chemistry without losing too much of that chemical content.
So then we had our specific project, which was really bringing our minds together in this space to think about it as an interdisciplinary project. So one of the main ideas that came from Alexandra, the philosopher, is that in our institutions, we have experts in the space, experts in philosophy, experts in ethics, historians, so various sociologists of science, and we don't really want the scientists and engineers dabbling in this space like it's a playground or stealing their thunder. So thinking about how can we leverage the expertise and work collaboratively to come up with something that's really of benefit to the STEM students. From my perspective as an engineer, the context is so important. I think as we've seen in quite a lot of the presentations, until we have the students connecting what it is they're learning and what they care about as scientists and engineers, they don't necessarily value the voices outside of science and engineering. When the faculty value that, when the faculty can collaborate and work together, then this increases the sense of the value for the students. So connecting to all of the questions of ethics and philosophy to the foundational knowledge was really what we were trying to do. So our goal in translating this is to value what the other disciplines already do and already know, and then come up with pathways to incorporate that knowledge within the STEM experience of our student learners, as well as outside of STEM. So our goal here was to create an ethics credential, something that people could think about from either a point of connecting within courses or externally, perhaps as a standalone course, or as an expectation for moving on into perhaps an internship. You should have considered these things. So our idea was to create some modules and to take advantage of modules that already exist. So connect to experts in the fields, hopefully make it very accessible to people. So not just at one institution, but multiple institutions. Using a platform like the Online Ethics Center. Also to really think about what is adaptable. How can we move towards really leveraging the context that the students are in, that the current faculty are in, so that things are meaningful for the people that are engaged in them. We want to think about so people were talking about the different stages of a scientific career. So making sure things are available for an introductory level, what stage of learning are students at, what are appropriate ethical questions for them to be dealing with. And then as they move throughout their learning, maybe the ethical questions become more challenging or more deeply connected to the science. We also really wanted to make sure that we're supporting the faculty in doing this, and encouraging interaction between the STEM faculty and the experts in that area. We also wanted things to be kind of short and sweet. What can somebody do in just one class, or maybe across 3 classes, so that we don't lose the connection to the technical content. So in thinking about modules, we wanted to make sure things are connected to the question of professional ethics. So how do we conduct research responsibly? What do we learn from different professional societies? There's a lot of codes of ethics that are set up by different societies. We also want to make sure we pull in the expertise that comes from the history and philosophy and practice of ethics. And then we wanted to connect it to personally relevant situations. So thinking about ethical considerations that students know might be facing. So I think, so if we return to the 3 design constraints and think about what kinds of things are we building, we want to make sure that when we work with the foundational knowledge, it's very connected to the STEM content. When we work with the humanistic knowledge, that we look at how do we connect to the experts in this space. And then when we think about the metacognitive or the meta-knowledge constraint, how do we do this so students deeply engage in this space? So this means thinking about interactive and student-centered learning, looking at things that connect them and engage them with their community, doing activities that push them into that space. So perhaps working with a local IRB, taking part in decisions that affect how research is done, shadowing a chaplain in a hospital to see what kinds of decisions people are making. So there's a lot of different ways of setting this up.
So if you navigate to that first link in the chat, you'll see a sample of one of these proposed modules. This is a sample from the 2nd category, History, Philosophy, and Sociology of Science. And this is the topic is the fair distribution of healthcare resources. It would be appropriate for any of those classes listed at the bottom, and I'm sure many more. Next slide. So these modules include a suggested readings that are pre-organized into a schedule. So the STEM faculty member doesn't have to think about how long is this reading going to take, how long is this reading going to take. A 1-sentence summary of each reading so the STEM faculty member can gauge relevance. In-class discussion sections, 2 active learning assignments, 1 traditional essay assignment. And then I really think it's important to credit teaching products. Teaching products are creative. They come from authors. So it includes author credit and contact information.
So that's an ethical decision as well. So one last component of this is really thinking about assessment in this space. And this is a challenge for STEM faculty to think about, well, I can't assign a paper because how am I going to grade a paper? How can I grade this written work? So we also don't want it to be fluff. We don't want this to be a throwaway assignment, but something that students spend time and energy on. And so then thinking about how we assess this well is a challenge. So, so I turned to the philosopher and said, how do you do this?
So what we envision is a 90-minute tutorial how to grade an ethics paper that the STEM faculty member could watch and get some information about what kinds of things are valued in a writing assignment, how to gauge length, time to completion, what to tell your students before they start writing, how to present the assignment. Most importantly, for a humanist is how to help students develop a topic. So how are you going to help them narrow it down? Where will they find their thesis? How will they develop their argument? Structure of a typical argumentative paper, what to look for when you're grading. This video would have sample rubrics. And then finally, I think most informative would be about a 20-25 minute video of somebody actually grading a paper in real time. So you can see what people go through in their minds when they're grading a piece of written work.
So that leads us to our vision. What can we do with this? And so the idea of a credential, of something that can be made available to people to think about, something that is potentially externally evaluated. Other people have brought up of how do we let people know that students have thought about this? This might be something students could take into a first job. I have specifically thought about it. I completed this certificate or this training. That has potential value as a society. We care about credentialing things. So in this vision, we'd have 30 to 40 modules across these three categories. We would want to solicit content and gather it as well. Some of this exists in different places. So thinking about the responsible conduct of research, there are a lot of modules for this already, but how this gets taught locally might end up including assignments that aren't just doing a quiz after a video, not just simple recall, but things that let students get into some of the depth of this. Looking at the history, philosophy, and sociology, looking at modules that might come from professional organizations to give some of the professional space, and then thinking about what are personal decision-making modules that students could really engage in deeply. So connecting this to macroethics and microethics. We'd want to make sure these are reviewed, I think, and then it's important to have things assessed as well before they go out into the wild. And then making these available on a space like the Online Ethics Center. And of course, we see this as a potential grant proposals since the creation of this is a time-consuming thing. So with that, there might be a minute for clarification questions, but otherwise we'll look forward to the discussion of this in the context of this entire conference. And Chris, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Interesting. Good stuff. Credentials. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat, so we will proceed to the final paper presentation. Social responsibility development in undergraduate STEM students, influences and inhibitors. And welcome to fellow Georgians at Georgia Institute of Technology.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear and see all right?
Yes.
Great. And I'll just say, I think those resources would be wonderful. I'd love to use those in teaching. So greetings, everyone. My name is Daniel Schiff. I'm a PhD student at Georgia Tech. I think Jason Borenstein, one of the project leads, is with us today. Jason's a philosopher in the policy school. Ellen Zagura is in computer science. And I'm happy to be here sharing our research on social responsibility development and some of the influences and inhibitors we've found. So I'll start by giving you some context for why we're studying this, how it fits in with the broader workshop theme, and then I'll go over our mixed methods approach briefly and share some key findings and takeaways. Okay, so some background on the project. There's a line of research I'm sure many of you are familiar with that engineering students' attitudes about social responsibility will actually, they'll either remain flat or even decline over the course of their undergraduate careers. And that's, of course, a cause for concern. We all know the important work that many engineers and STEM graduates do. And educators, researchers like yourselves have tried to foster social responsibility development or moral or ethical development through various strategies: ethics education, case studies we heard about, storytelling and imagination. But there's a lot about what might be effective or even how social responsibility development happens that isn't well understood. And what I want to suggest regarding the broader workshop theme is that the kinds of ethical cultures and norms that we see in places like research laboratories or classrooms are shaped by the broader environments in universities and before college when students grow up through influences like classes and peer interaction and many other things. And that includes both personal and professional social responsibility. So we began by looking at the entire entering cohort of undergraduates in 2017, and we've been following them through to graduation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our core research questions is, how do students develop social responsibility attitudes? Do they increase, decrease, remain flat? We're also trying to better understand the connection between personal and professional social responsibility. And here we've been drawing on the professional social responsibility development model, or the PSRDM from Canny and Bielefeld. And this framework essentially looks at how individuals' personal social responsibility attitudes and the professional development in college kind of converge together to lead towards an ultimate sense of professional social responsibility. And we also want to note what kinds of experiences and influences shape students, whether that's classes or teachers or internships or community engagement. That's something that our project looks quite a bit at, or whether these impacts differ by student characteristics like gender or race. So to help answer these questions, we've been using a mixed methods longitudinal design, and we've been iterating our questions over time and trying to triangulate findings. So we started by surveying students right as they entered university, again at the midpoint of their career, and they're currently being surveyed for a third time. And along the way, we've also been interviewing just a subset of those students. So today, I'll be sharing kind of this first 2/3, our findings from this work. Okay, I'll cover methods briefly, but I'm happy to answer more questions later if that's helpful. Our primary instrument for the quantitative work is the Generalized Professional Responsibility Assessment, or the GPRA. And this is adapted from an instrument called the EPRA, a similar instrument also based on that PSRDM framework I mentioned. And the survey basically has a battery of questions about social responsibility attitudes in different domains. And it includes questions about the kinds of community engagement experiences, sort of like volunteering, but broader, that students engage in high school or college, and a few other questions about career choices. And as mentioned, we administered this to the entire entering cohort twice so far. And the analysis I'll present is based on the first 2 time points. We had 128 students who completed both surveys. I'm happy to talk about sample or attrition if anyone likes. We've also been studying the graduating classes each year as they complete their degrees, just to examine university level trends. And our analysis would have ordinarily squares regression, some descriptive measures, looking at how does social responsibility change over time, what are the effects of community engagement in particular, and we have a special interest in what we've termed discipline-based and peer-based community engagement. Just to give you a sense of our sample, these are some key descriptors. So our sample is about half male and female, about half white and non-white, majority engineering, majority US and not first generation. We also have measures for a few different domains within social responsibility and measures of community engagement intensity, basically asking students how often they do certain activities and then averaging and scaling them in different categories. So for example, a discipline-based CE, we might ask how often you engage with communities through internships or as a member of a student chapter of a professional association. Okay, qualitative portion. This essentially was semi-structured interviews asking students about their major and profession, why they even chose to pursue them, what kinds of influences like teachers and peers mattered to them. And we've now interviewed the same students twice, about 20 students, though I'm presenting results only from the first round of interviews. And for this, we created a code book based on our conceptual framework, did some reliability testing, and we wrote a 5 to 7 page memo for each student. And that's where our thematic analysis comes from. And this is our qualitative sample. Again, it's a kind of similar approximation, half male, female, half white and non-white, a mix of majors, a variety, but mostly engineering. All right, so here is some of what we've learned in the last few years. So first, consistent with prior research, students don't seem to have much of any change in their social responsibility attitudes between high school and mid-college. So whether we're talking about kind of personal social awareness or overall social responsibility in a professional sense, it's pretty flat, though there are some modest gains in professional development. So they're learning some of those core technical and professional skills or ideas. And even the students who seem to really care about wanting to be a responsible professional tended to talk about it as a kind of loose constraint, maybe something they could defer until later in their career, perhaps. So a student in industrial engineering said, well, the little bit of exposure I've had, it's geared more towards gaining skills rather than being ethical. I'm not saying it's not a topic of concern, it's just the priority is to gain skills at this point. Another student said, I've tried a little bit, but this is my first internship. I'm just looking for a place to start. And I have my dream goals, but you got to start from baby steps. And of course, a concern might be that if students are taught that they can deprioritize or sort of bracket social responsibility, then they might just do that. Another surprising finding for us was that some students held explicitly a view of social responsibility that was really emphasizing kind of small acts of kindness rather than the public good broadly, what we've discussed as sort of macro ethics. And some even explicitly argued against doing this through work or in a macro ethical sense. So as an example, one student told us, I know wherever I end up working, I can find a church, I can get engaged with that. I do want to have a societal impact, but that's not something I'm looking for in or through the workplace. And we saw a number of students with similar attitudes. In fact, our qualitative paper, we discussed this broader divide between someone's personal social responsibility values, which are often things like being a good friend and tolerant of others, and potential professional social responsibility attitudes. So many students just weren't drawing the connection between the things they personally valued and what their profession is all about. And when they did focus on the professional side, they often did focus on this microethical dimension, like, I want to be nice to my coworkers, I don't want to lie to my clients, but they often didn't discuss the broader public good concerns related to their profession. Something else that came up, and this won't be terribly surprising, is this socio-technical divide in STEM education. So when students did learn about broader social issues, it was almost exclusively in social sciences, humanities, even business courses. So one student said in the STEM courses, it's basically about designing products for an end goal, engineering specifications, customer needs, but it's not necessarily targeted at improving specific groups of people's lives. But something worth adding here is it's not just the focus on technical learning on the content itself, but the broader culture of STEM work, which was sort of emphasizing grades and survival. So a student who had taken courses in both STEM and social sciences said, these STEM classes just feel like you're there to sit down and learn the information. And if you don't, it's like, too bad. It doesn't feel like I'm learning to grow myself. I'm just there to complete the work to get a degree. So this kind of culture potentially squeezes out students' sense that social responsibility is important or valued in their discipline. even squeezes out their own identities and values in some ways. So turning your attention to some positive influences rather than inhibitors. This is a recent quantitative finding. We're just writing up a paper about this now. But the third model here on the right shows the impact of our measure of community engagement on social responsibility attitudes. And this is controlling for students' pre-college attitudes, because we had surveyed them earlier. So it's really a change over time. And it's also controlling for things like student gender, race, religion. And what we found is that a 1 standard deviation in our community engagement intensity score is associated with about a 0.14 standard deviation increase in one's social responsibility attitudes. And that's statistically significant. And it's a larger influence than, say, gender or religion. So that's promising. Another really interesting influence was the idea of social interaction and peer influence. So many students talk about coming to college and seeing a more diverse group of people for the first time, which challenge their views or help them express their values in new ways. So this one student talked about being around a diverse group of people, how her roommate was from Puerto Rico right as the hurricanes were happening, and that made her realize this was something she already cared about, given her prior values. So she sort of learned to express her prior values in new ways. And through interviews, we found students were often referencing their peers and classmates when they were reflecting on how they were developing their values and learning about their professions. So this graph below is from the surveys of the graduating classes. That's the graduates of each year. And what's interesting to note is about 30 to 40% of students say they participate in community engagement to spend time with friends. And more students cite this than, for example, doing it as part of professional development. So we think this peer influence is potentially quite important. Let me just offer a few caveats. Of course, our student population, our samples may not be fully externally valid, depending on the student population that you're working with. We did also have some attrition between our 2 samples. We did some testing and we don't see that demographics or pre-college attitudes predicted whether a student dropped out of the second survey, but something to note. Another important element is that we asked students about a wide variety of community engagement experiences, but many of these aren't probably following the kinds of best practices that you've all been articulating. In that sense, our findings are probably even a little bit conservative, meaning that even a mix of high and low quality community engagement may make a difference. And then finally, what we've presented is up through the midpoint of the student career. We expect students to take more upper level classes, internships, potentially have more meaningful changes in their attitudes. So the items I presented are certainly not an exhaustive list of influences and inhibitors. All right, let me end with some takeaways. I hope some of these are actionable or food for thought, and at least a little bit novel. So the first is that as educators, as mentors, as administrators, you may be inheriting an uphill battle in a sense. And what we mean by that is that students pick their majors for intellectual interest and fit. That's what they told us. And their parents are the greatest influence on them before college, but the parents emphasize being a good person, but not how that connects to their professional identity. So students are coming into college with a personal and professional divide already in place. And our suggestion is it's never too soon for you to emphasize these connections to your students, to your research assistants, in particular to emphasize some of those macro ethical dimensions about the role of someone's career vis-a-vis the broader public good. Another observation, especially in the context of STEM education, is that this human element really matters. Students are so consumed with technical learning and grades and getting jobs that it can keep a broader identity from developing. And based on how students discuss the teachers and courses that inspire them the most, things like compassion and openness and time to have dialogue and reflect on issues in classes could be especially important in STEM and even in laboratory culture. As I mentioned, we're finding that community engagement can be effective. For you, that might mean fostering conversations with communities, bringing them into your work setting, or just discussing social issues that are connected to your work. And then finally, we think one of the underappreciated levers is peer influence. We had students who took the ethics courses and did all that kind of work, but what reached them the most was some alumni coming in on a panel and talking about the implications of their job. So we think maybe there are more ways that we can leverage peer influence, foster relationships between students or junior scholars, bring alumni to share their perspectives, and so on. All right, here are references, our qualitative papers here, and happy to share it. And also happy to share the survey instrument in case people would like to use that to assess social responsibility. And please do feel free to reach out to share thoughts or brainstorm, and I look forward to the rest of the workshop conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Lots of discussion that we can do about this. Okay, so let's see. We're open for questions. Yes, Alexandra.
That was so interesting. I just had a question for Daniel. You talked a little bit about the students who left. Given the end game influence of peers, I was just curious about, do you think that the students who have a high school interest in social responsibility, are they just not even exploring science at all because they have this feeling that they won't be able to manifest who they are within a STEM environment? Or is it that they get into STEM and then they realize everybody around them doesn't care about these broader social political issues, so they're like, oh, I'm going to go major in political science? So that sort of question of self-selection, or what happens to the students who come in with this passion for broader social work?
That's a great question. It's certainly been on our minds. I think the answer is probably both. And through the midpoint, it seems like many of the student attitudes are quite fixed, and the students who really cared about this stuff before college still care about it, and maybe they learn to expand on it and what it really means in their profession. And students who didn't emphasize it much continue to not emphasize it. But we also saw these examples, that music technology student I mentioned who took the STEM courses, were like, I'm not even a human in these courses, what's going on? And they switched into the social sciences. And we haven't run numbers on whether this predicts moving from STEM to other fields, but I think that's a really important consideration. And finally, you have students who think the issues are important, but then they get the message that maybe you can defer them or minimize them. And then they, as other panels talked about, you go into the job and then suddenly that's not really part of what the job is supposed to be anymore. But it would be great for us our team to try to quantify some of that stuff a little bit more and get a sense for which of those possible trends are more dominant.
Very interesting. Questions? I also had a question for Daniel, Jason, and Ellen. And that's, since you've been doing this study for a while, like, did you start in 2019, did you say?
I think 2017, I came on maybe a year later.
Okay, so are you seeing by any chance an increase in people's attitudes towards social responsibility in the later years compared to the earlier years? I'm wondering about the larger context and the influence.
Yeah, that's a really important question. So we haven't run the survey data on the whole student body. Actually, the survey is being administered right now, and we're waiting to assess those changes. We have done the second round of interviews with just that subset of students. And one of the things that's really striking is the number of students who have talked about, unsurprisingly, COVID and how that's influenced them, what they've been able to do, what they've not been able to do, but also sort of racial and social justice issues. So a huge number of students are discussing Black Lives Matter, are discussing protests, are discussing even the concept of privilege shows up pretty regularly. Wow. So we think some of those current events and issues, the political environment, could really be exerting an influence. But we'll know more hopefully in the next 6 months.
That will be interesting. look forward to that. Other questions?
Looks like Becky has a question.
I do have a
Okay, I'm
question.
not getting my full screen, so thank you.
Okay, so I am super curious about the results of your interviews and the next survey results, because I have seen some results that show that engineering students actually lose their sense of social responsibility, and more challengingly, their sense that it has value within their fields as they go through education. That a lot of students decide to become engineers because they see how it could help. They spend 4 years in engineering education and don't. And that's really challenging. So I'm really looking forward to your results, and hopefully thinking about how we can address this in our educational space. One thing that I was wondering about in the social responsibility concerns, where is inclusion as a professional value? Because I see that as, just in how engineers are creative and think about designs and the voices that are brought into the design process. Inclusion is an active skill that people can develop. So did that come up anywhere, like either in your first set of interviews or perhaps in your second set, where now maybe they're a little more aware of it? What are you seeing, even if it's not official data?
Really, really interesting question. So in terms of the survey instrument, there's something like 45 different questions, and some of them address what I think we would think of as inclusion, but not touching on every element. Now, the students talk about it in a number of different ways. A lot of their focus in the earlier interviews was on these sort of interpersonal dynamics. So we had students who talked about, I was in friend group X, and then I saw how they were mean to each other and they said bad things to each other. And then I joined friend group Y and I saw how they were tolerant and inclusive and they didn't marginalize people for certain characteristics. So students are definitely aware of it in that sense. And some of them had thought to extend that to how they wanted to treat their professional peers. Later on, as I noted, there's much more of a focus on explicit racial issues, a little bit of a focus on gender issues, and something that comes up quite a lot, and I don't know if this is a Georgia Tech thing or an undergraduate thing, is mental health. So there's been some challenges and issues on our campus, I'm sure elsewhere, I'm sure especially in the last year and a few years, but that's something that's really speaking to students who've experienced it or their friends or classmates have experienced it. So they're thinking about this in a number of ways. It's just that piece of, can you make that connection into your professional life, and does it stick, and how far does it carry?
I think Jason has a question.
I was just going to ask a quick follow-up to Becky, although it's not, well, two things. First is you mentioned the attitudes of engineers, that their social responsibility attitudes may decrease over time. Are you referring to Czech's work or another body of work there? That's my first question. Then I have a follow-up for your presentation, if you don't mind.
I don't know. I am horrible about remembering where I learned something. So I have to deeply apologize for not being able to point you to exactly where I got that knowledge. What I know is that it's been brought into my engineering programs to think about what do we do with this? So I can't point you to where I got the information.
It didn't mean to put you on the spot on that, but I was just curious if you had a literature for us. So about your presentation, I just was going to ask a bit more about the credentialing. So I'm wondering if you've within the team talked about the benefits and drawbacks to credentialing, because essentially, if I understood correctly, you may be credentialing people who had a few lessons on ethics. So I'm curious about, again, the thought process of calling it a credential, if you don't mind.
I think what we're thinking of is that it would be a resource for local institutions to develop their own sense of that. So for example, if a department wanted to require an ethics seminar as part of their major, they could use these resources for that kind of credentialing. Or if a school wanted to offer an actual certificate like a minor, they could turn to these kinds of resources. Or if even an after-school club wanted to get people ready for an ethics bowl or something, and they wanted to credential the young members of their club in order to be the traveling members of their club, they could use these resources too. So the credentialing wouldn't be a top-down thing like you can get a credential from the Online Ethics Center as an ethicist, but it would be resources that would be available to institutions that wanted to set up something a little bit more official.
Thank you.
I think Elizabeth has a question.
Yeah, I am thinking all of these three projects, they are sort of fighting an uphill battle, isn't it? And maybe I'm thinking of this because I have similar experiences of fighting uphill battles at our institution. To be honest, Alexandra and Rebecca, Kelly and I, we have been trying to develop modules at our institution for a while, and we have had talks with our engineering dean. How many years ago was this? But never did we succeed to add one of these, to even develop one of these modules. And we never got to this step. And I looked at your suggestion, with the quality of life adjusted years. And I think, yeah, that's fantastic. That's wonderful. I'm just not sure whether anyone, at least at our university, would like to spend. And this is not a criticism. This is just the experience I was facing, or we are facing. Would like to spend, let's say, 3-4 sessions on this. And I'm just asking how you are achieving this. And a similar question to Daniel and Jason. I mean, how can we expect that the social responsibility is going to increase for engineering students if we don't teach anything about social responsibility, or if we don't do anything about social responsibility, except these community engagement activities? I mean, they may be a good step, but at least maybe you do more at Georgia Tech in that direction. I just don't know. I was thinking of my institution again. I mean, I don't want to paint it too negatively, but and similar with the lab safety thing and the idea of, yeah, there is an aspect where we are being controlled, where we are under pressure, where you have to look good, and that's similarly an uphill battle in the sense of, I mean, there's no real motivation for transparency on the side of those who are supposed to being controlled, and that's similar. So I mean, it's and I feel so much on the same boat because I mean, there seems to be a problem, at least what I've learned so far. So maybe you have some thoughts on this, suggestions, responses. I don't know. Maybe your institutions just do really much better than ours.
I can say that engineering has a club. And by a club, I mean like bash you over the head with a club of accreditation. And so that helps in engineering spaces because we are expected to be able to show that we have at least told students there might be an ethical challenge that they should deal with. And I think that the sciences don't have that quite as much in terms of how it gets incorporated in the education space. And so then it's much more about things like this curricular development thing that Alexandra and I did. That was a National Science Foundation funded project to get a lot of people across the United States thinking about how do we incorporate these in a new vision of STEM education for the future. And so there are some levers around funding, around conversations, around expectations. But I think there's also, and so that might be something that can be brought into a local institution. Like, well, there's potential funding for this, let's try this. Or there's an expectation for this, let's try this. Or we are not going to look very good in comparison if our curriculum doesn't have this. And so just like the peer pressure was showing up in Daniel's work, I think using the peer pressure of accreditation bodies, of different curricula, what engages students, what lets them be successful in completing majors. A lot of this idea of, we've just heard a bunch of stories of losing STEM majors because they can't be whole people. That's crushing. How can we do this? How can we retain students? And so then the conversation with administrators is about money. They don't have to have the same motivation for using the same ends as we do. So we can retain more STEM students if we let them be whole people. What does that involve? Well, let's think about these big ideas, the macro ethics. The ones that are going to be engineers because they want to do some technology things and not have and compartmentalize ethics and positive activity from doing design. They're going to learn the engineering skills anyway. But a curriculum that pulls us all together and lets students be their whole selves, then we might actually be addressing retention. Then we can present it as dollars, and that'll pull some people in.
And I think that, you know, there are no structural incentives for adding work to your teaching. So it's extremely important to just ask them to do one tiny thing and to visit their offices. So you visit their office or you have lunch and you say, would you consider doing this 20-minute thing in one of your classes? And then, so I feel like this all has to start so small, because there's going to be no will for let's change our department to be socially responsible by adding in all of this extra course prep when you're only going to get to full professor if we see publications. Like, it's just not going to work. But if you ask people to just do one tiny little thing, because everyone else is doing it, I think Becky's so right about that. You know, we're going to be behind unless we start paying attention to these issues. We're going to have a hard time getting grants unless we show that we're doing these things. Just starting with the tiny little, like one class day.
I was just going to answer quickly about the Georgia Tech landscape, because I think, Elizabeth, you asked about that as well. So part of what motivated the creation of this project, what led to us proposing it with NSF, is that our quality enhancement plan that was emerging just before we wrote our proposal was called Serve, Learn, Sustain. And Georgia Tech was seeking to make it part of its identity, part of the culture of the campus, that students would have all sorts of different kinds of service learning and community engagement experiences. It's not to say we've solved all the kinds of problems that we're talking about in over the last 2 days. We certainly have our challenges like everybody else, but Georgia Tech was trying to make it part of its, more fully part of its identity. And so again, part of the motivation for the project was to see if this quality enhancement plan was really working in some sense.
Yeah, I seem to remember you had an NSF project, isn't it, about community engagement?
Yeah, I mean, the work Daniel was discussing today is funded by that grant.
What was the name of the provost? I think he presented this at several times, isn't it?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Something up. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah. No, I can see your point also, what Becky and what Alexandra said. Yeah, I mean, that's also true. Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly why community engagement was the technique that we focused on, as opposed to pedagogical techniques, for example. But I think your question, Elizabeth, is the question. It's been, you know, I'm on mine for the last 3 years. I'm newer to this than some people. But as a policy person, I'm thinking about both these sort of micro levers that you were talking about how can we influence an individual teacher or a department? What are the inroads? And also, can we make the case that employers care about this more? Can we change credentials? Or is this about changing the norms for who will become the future STEM professors, so that they know a little bit about it and they know a little bit about how to teach it, and then they start to integrate it into their courses in 10 years. So I don't know, I think we have to pursue all of these levers. But it certainly strikes me that we're doing a lot of things that we already know don't work. We know that the single ethics course isn't enough, but spreading all of these best practices around the country and the world is this extremely major challenge. So things like this workshop are, part of how we're building this institutional knowledge.
Yeah.
And can I just say that I really see the connections between what Melinda and Maria were talking about, that where are the teachable moments in all of these spaces, that we got a lot of good examples about how it connects to chemistry. And this is the regulation side is a potential club in the science space as well, because what happens if you're not aware of this? What happens if you're not dealing with this? And finding those points where somebody is ready to learn is crucial.
Yeah. I think James has a question.
Yeah, just wondered if Becky and Alexandra could talk about what did you all try to come up with certain competencies that you wanted people to have from those modules? I mean, is there if you were going to say to someone, well, we want you to contribute a module, and okay, to make the world more ethical place. It seems like that's a fairly broad sort of thing. Was there a sense from your own experience in teaching engineers? Are there certain things we want engineers to be able to do with ethics that could then be put up there as sometimes I think that comes along just as you're working on the modules. I mean, my list of competencies that I was putting up that I think that are important for people in all STEM disciplines comes out of having worked on teaching ethics for 25 years or so, and kind of then at points reflecting on, okay, what specifically am I trying to get them to be able to do operationally when they go out into the business world? And and I'm just imagining what people in STEM would need. I mean, my only real experience with STEM was a high school NSF summer science camp, where a professor showed us how to pour certain chemicals together and something happened, and but so, I mean, I come to this as someone who's a total outsider, but I just wondered if people who are inside, like you all are much more than I am, have had a chance to reflect on what specific kinds of things do you think they ought to be able to do?
I think just quickly, one of the things that I think gets left out a lot that's important to the people on the humanities side in terms of that thing about don't dabble and don't steal their thunder. There are standard canonical ethical approaches. There are virtue ethics, utilitarianism, divine command theory, ethics of care. And part of being able to answer ethical questions is to know that history and to know how those debates go. So there's a content here. It's not just about the way medical ethics is done, where students encounter a case and then you have a discussion. There's scholarship to be done and there's knowledge to be gained. So an important part, I think, to a humanist would be to see the scientists demanding some kind of competency in the actual material, in the content of the discipline, beyond being just discursive in these issues and being developing good judgment. In terms of producing the modules, I think it would be important to, we have a little thing about what kinds of credentials we'd be looking for in the authors of the modules. But in terms of the assessment part at the end, what are the students supposed to be able to do? This is a very tricky question in philosophy that philosophers really struggle with. How should they do assessment? But one thing that I think is clear is that there's a content to our discipline. There's a matter to it. It's not just talking. So you would want to see some of that. You'd want to see the STEM students covering that landscape in some way, whether that means requiring a philosophy course or just doing one of the approaches within the context of your course. But anyway, yeah.
Well, would there be a sense also that as you're respecting other people's disciplines, and I mean, I have a PhD in philosophy and an MBA, so I mean, I got in somehow asked the university president, where should I work? Should I work in the College of Business or in the philosophy department? Well, at that point, the philosophy department was fighting with each other to such a degree that he said, oh, go in the College of Business. Well, it turned out to be perfect for me because I'd also had business experience and then had all these colleagues who had business questions that we could work together with on research and publication and things like that. And what my sense of the dialogue also has to be that the people who have the content expertise in philosophy have to keep coming up with ways that our business students could actually use the vocabulary and the processes in a business context. And of course, that's not what they're getting rewarded for in philosophy. They're getting rewarded to be better at explaining what supererogatory duties are or something like that. And that's how they get published. So it was it wasn't just respecting the other discipline, because often our students would come back and say, well, I took philosophy 316, but I got an A, but that's not stuff I can use. And so it seems to me that again, trying to come up with a competency might help the people in the specific discipline say, okay, you want us to teach your majors in management, are there things that you want us to, for them to be able to do? And then some dialogue going on. And, and for some people in the humanities, they'd say, hey, look, that's not what I'm interested in. That's not what I do. And others, I think, would find that an interesting challenge. I mean, but I mean, great enterprise. I mean, I think that's wonderful. And my own problem is that, that I no longer am in a place where I'm paid a salary and my assistant isn't paid a salary. And I've got to figure out a way, if I'm going to get my stuff out that I've got to find people who are willing to pay something for it, or else, she's not going to be around and able to put the course up or get the material out or respond to, when the platform breaks down or something like that. I mean, those are all things that I've experienced and being retired. I mean, what's time to a pig? What's time to a retired person? It's there's a problem there, and maybe I keep hoping maybe I could find a way to get funded by somebody to then be able to pay her and recoup some of the stuff, the money that I've spent on all the illustrations and all of that, which I didn't do myself because I can't draw a good crooked line. But I mean, so it's a wonderful, interesting project to be involved in, and I salute you for for all and everyone else at the conference. I mean, I think the practical focus of this was really a good idea.
And Brooke, I will say, I really appreciate the slide on your About Us page that says being personally ethical may not make you effectively ethical in professional settings. You need a vocabulary for explaining your ethical judgments. I really liked that. And I think that some of this is, especially for engineers, which is my context, a competency is, what is the language? How do you explain? We ask for this, we ask for the justification of a design. We ask for the justification of a technical solution. So now if you're making a decision, how do you explain to somebody how and why you made that decision? Because you are going to have to defend it. So thinking about that vocabulary and checking, do students have this vocabulary? So the historical context, so that you know that there are different ways of thinking about things, the vocabulary that lets you justify and defend your argument, even if somebody else could reasonably come to a different decision, and then being able to move forward with that. So then, kind of the muscles of making these decisions, defending them, so that when you get into a place where you're faced with ethical dilemmas, that you know what vocabulary to go to, you know what decision process to go to. And I think, you know, just looking over your website, the examples of the tests, I'm going to apply this test this week and see what kind of decision I'd make, or compare the outcomes of two of the decision-making tests or processes. Helping engineers have a framework for doing this is, I think, really, really valuable. So I like that, but I think then we do start to think about competencies. So do you know the types of processes? Do you know the vocabulary to explain your decision? And can you do it repeatedly? These are competencies I would want to see.
I also just want to go back to Melinda's work, which I was just reading through her case study again, and just I'm so impressed by how you frame that in terms of teachable moments and that positive kind of mindset. Because in the work we've been doing, we found that as well, when you can get in there in the lab in the right moment, you know, the discussion you have there is so much more impactful than if it is, you know, done in a different setting where they're not in that framework, where they're seeing the direct reaction or, you know, how this is impacting other people or their own work. So I think it's, you know, one of the things we wanted to do in this workshop is to think about, you know, where we put ethics education. I think Melinda's work is a great example of how to positively engage that in different ways and different frameworks.
If I can chime in here, because I know Melinda is never going to toot her own horn. The fact that Melinda has taken the time to identify those teachable moments and develop them into something that can be shared with the whole department. The fact that she has taken the time to take our inspections, our safety inspections, and turn them around into an opportunity to celebrate the good things that labs are doing has really changed the culture of safety in our department. I mean, I've been at NC State for 20 years. I was there before Melinda came along. So I remember the before times when a safety inspection alarm was the time for you to hide all your clutter and all the things you didn't want the inspectors to see. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. That's not good for anybody. So having somebody in charge of our safety culture who is compassionate, which I think is very important. It's at the core of all the things that have been said today, compassion for what other people are going through. And B, has a teaching lens through which she sees the world, right? So instead of hiding the clutter, we have done away with the clutter. Instead of fearing the safety inspection, we look forward to see what is the positive feedback that's going to come from the safety inspection. It is a complete mind switch to go from a punitive safety inspection culture to a positive safe inspection culture. And I think anybody that has lived through that transition can tell you that this is much better. And not only is it much better, it's, you know, it's transparent. We can pass this on to our students knowing that, you know, that what we're giving them is valuable and they're going to take it with them when they go. So I mean, I usually sit down and pat Melinda in the back for the good job that she does, but I don't think that I have put a framework around it. And I have seen it as clearly as when we prepared this presentation, you know, that all of this comes from an ethical background into what goes into a safety culture, what needs to happen so we can transform safety cultures in other places. And it just comes from that sensitivity and that ability to teach. And I think that's invaluable, you know, and if we could bottle that and share that, that would be, you know, I would feel like I've done right by her. You know, it's really a big mind shift that she has brought along.
Well, that seems to me that that's also true in the research that Melinda was doing that was so impressive to me in terms of looking at the relationship between negative and positive feedback. I mean, one of the things that John Haidt, who's one of the ones who's done a lot of the neuroscience research on ethics, but he talks about the fact that people can have an ethical approach and come up with different conclusions because they're seeing different patterns or whatever, or in my case, you know, they're also using a different interpretation of an ethics test or whatever. It seems to me that that one of the things that's valuable in Haidt's insight is you don't tell people, and also in Darcia Navarez's notion about survival, being driven back to survival ethics by a threat, that you don't tell people you're unethical and then expect them to be able to listen to you and engage in a dialogue with you about, you know, whether they should change their judgment or not. I mean, you've got to be positive about the fact that they are being ethical, and by listening to them and figuring out how they're getting to their conclusions, and then suggest why yours are better. And I thought, wow, there's this whole literature out there, thank you, that talks about the need to, you know, and what the relationship between giving them the negative and that they will remember because you gave them specific positive things. And one of the things I think in the ethics side of that, in paralleling the safety side, is if you can tell them, I see how you are arriving at this ethical conclusion. I see what pattern you're seeing and what emotion you're feeling, or I see which ethics test you use, or I know which crowd you are referencing to who has been able to give you this good advice or good example. And then this is why I don't agree with that, you know, but being able to put that in the context of this whole literature, thank you. I mean, I'm going to go look at that. You know, that looks like it's really a good thing, and too bad that, you know, well, good thing that we as parents also can learn about that and do that you know, that you know you're going to get a better result because by the fact that you're couching your criticism in terms of also some affirming, and you know, but thanks. I thought that was great that you and Maria have done that.
And I wanted to point out one more thing, because I don't know if you guys had a chance to see the case study that Melinda presented ahead of time. But just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with here, that case study is about a student that set fire to a solvent in a chemistry lab because he or she was bored. And that the risk that this person took and imposed on all their neighbors cannot be overemphasized. I mean, a fire in a chemistry laboratory is deadly. There's no other way to put it. And she was able to take that information with a lot more compassion than I would have taken it, because I would have freaked out, and frame it in a way that it was informative for everybody else, that brought attention to the fact that because of the pandemic conditions, we are working in such an isolated way that boredom is a real issue. And a bored person is a person that can make very bad decisions, and it doesn't make them a bad person. And she was able to frame all of that and package it in a way that it could be sent to the whole chemistry department. So it brought awareness for everybody that we need to be aware that things like this can happen to us. This didn't happen to that student because it was a bad student or a bad person. This is somebody who made a bad decision because of the conditions of work that they were experiencing. I mean, it takes a lot of sensitivity to take such a scary moment and turn it into a teachable moment for the whole department. So I mean, even though I write with Melinda and I'm her co-author in a lot of things, she wrote that case study all by herself, and she shared that with the department. That is her work, and that is exceptional work. I mean, the amount of self-actualization that person has to do to be able to share that information with the whole department, it's really remarkable. And the reception of the department, I mean, there was no shaming, there was no finger pointing. It was just, we all need to learn from what happened and move forward. I mean, that's what to me is so important about this ethical approach to safety. You know, how do we make things so we can all learn and we can all move on and be better because we went through this experience?
Also, I was so impressed with just that idea of culture shift from a punitive safety culture to a positive safety culture. I just thought that was such an interesting idea. And I was going to ask if you could see a similar thing happening around other things like, for example, animal use. So whenever I've worked at an institution, I used to work in the Communication Sciences and Disorders department at Northwestern, and the animal use there was locked in the basement. Nobody could go there. It was card, secured. It was so secretive. And I just wonder, once you sort of open up these once you decide, let's have an ethical conversation about our safety issues. Could there be like, well, let's have an ethical conversation about our use of non-human animals. Let's have an ethical conversation about our support from the defense industry, or let's have an ethical conversation about pharmaceutical funding. Once you open up, so you've opened up your lab to a broader conversation of safety. Could that be done with some of these other ethical issues within science departments, or is that something that universities aren't going to want to touch at all? And if they don't, then there's an interesting limit to these conversations where you're telling your science students and faculty, oh, let's bring the broader world into our science classes, but we're not going to question our pharmaceutical funding, and we're not going to question our defense funding, and we're not going to question, So I just think what you did was so interesting, and it raises these questions of, could it be done in other areas, or are there going to be absolute limits where STEM departments are going to be like, look, we're going to discuss A, but we are not discussing B.
I think that the thing that you're bringing up there that is really interesting is once you open the barn door, all the horses are going to get out, right? Like once you figure out that you can do this in one place, why couldn't you do it in all other places? So in our department, we had a really interesting experience recently. We brought along, because we want to learn more about diversity and inclusion, just like every other department in the country, we brought along a speaker who had taken the time to learn a little bit about our department. And one thing that he brought up in his talks and in his interactions with us is that he wanted to use the model of our changing the safety culture and use that model to change the diversity and inclusion culture within departments, right? So just like we have learned that we don't have to be punitive about safety, we can be proactive, positive, engaging, we can all aspire to be like that. Why can't we do the same thing about diversity, right? Highlight the good things that we're doing. That doesn't mean that we're going to sweep the racism under the carpet, but to take the same positive approach, right? Or there's an interaction that is not productive or not positive for a member of the department. Let's make it into a teachable moment so we can learn from what happened and take that and move forward. So I think that what you're mentioning, it's very valid because it's going to permeate everything that we do. I mean, we can't go back to being a punitive department because we've made this shift. And so we're not going to be punitive in our safety culture. We're hopefully not going to be punitive in our inclusion culture. And then hopefully that's going to spill down into all other areas, right? I hope that it's going to spill into our teaching culture. We've had this whole pandemic year to think about, what are compassionate practices that we can extend to our students? What can flexible deadlines do for our students? Digital offerings, all of those things. Can we take the same approach? Now that we know that we can shift our culture, can we take the same approach and let it permeate all those other spaces? And I hope the answer is yes. We're probably going to have to meet next year so we can talk about the outcomes. But I think that there is definite momentum, and that we should capitalize on that.
Okay, I think we are coming to the end of our session, and I don't know if there's one more maybe quick question before we move to our closing remarks. And we certainly appreciate everyone's attention and the lively discussion, and there's just been so much to think about and a lot to process.
I'm interested in making a comment. That's okay.
Yes.
So when Alexandra was asking, could you do that in the other animal handling realm? The way that was the big shift that began the process was I also have a lab. I also get inspected. So I imagined, okay, what would it be like if I got told I had these violations? And the biggie was, I need help figuring out how to solve this. The other thing I've learned as part of being a safety officer is it's hugely risky to be a whistleblower. And when you teach people ethics, you're kind of inviting them to do that. So I think part of the ethics education, it's important to help people, you know, recognize we understand this is a risk. This isn't necessarily a benefit. You can't put that on a resume. So when approaching things, ask, why would they want to do it in terms of how this would benefit them? Certainly being a whistleblower is not all that beneficial. It benefits the institution, but how can I frame it so this person sees how it benefits them individually? So in the case of the animal handling, you know, how try to approach it in a way that you acknowledge this could get in the way of, you know, how fast you get things done or who you get funding from, and that would be an obstacle. Therefore, in what ways would thinking ethically actually be something you would consider a benefit kind of thing?
Mhm. Great. Thank you. Lots to think about, lots to process here. Lots. Okay. So Kelly and Elizabeth and Eric are here. And Elizabeth, are you going to lead us in the concluding remarks here and see if we can try to put a pin in this and where we might go forward?
Yeah, I think we should do all this all together, isn't it? And think about
Yes.
what we've learned. I think this was an amazing day today, and also yesterday we learned we had a lot of wonderful presentations and learned a lot about what can we done, what we can try to do, how we can improve. And thank you everyone. This was really fantastic, also for the comments and everything. Concluding remarks from my side, and I know Chris was thinking about next step, about what we could do. Maybe Chris, you talk about this later. What I wanted to say, I started putting together this book proposal. You remember I've contacted you, and most of you have responded to me. Well, they are interested in contributing a chapter to this collected volume, and this is something we will pursue for sure. It's almost done. I think I submitted a preliminary version to Chris Wilby and Flora for just so that they have a look at it, and obviously they think this is a good idea. So I would just proceed with this. Maybe we can get some additional chapters. If I'm correct, we have 14 or so chapters right now, or 15, I have to check. So most of you responded that they would be willing to contribute a chapter, or that they like to do this. And yeah, we would just move forward with this. I think that's the most immediate, most direct step. Maybe you have other thoughts how we could proceed. Chris, maybe you want to.
Well, yeah, I'm always big on next steps, but I'm just kind of speechless at the moment, again, because there's just so much to process. I have no idea what that might be. But I really love the idea of doing a collective volume, and with that, I'm also, you know, again, as a PhD anthropology, and the fact that we're so text-based, I'm very big on accessibility, and I would love to see how we might, like as somebody said, expand the choir, like get the work out to, beyond the disciplines, maybe beyond academia. And that's a big deal. So I'm not sure, but I love the idea of the collected volume, definitely.
Yeah, and we can think about doing a project together, somehow combine our forces and see what we can achieve. I mean, this could be something, if people are interested. I don't know what others think. Maybe you just us your feedback or your thoughts, whatever is possible. Realistic.
I also wanted to bring up a potential possibility. I know people who are engaged with the Association for Practical and Professional Ethics, there is a responsible conduct of research forum that is open, and it'd be maybe interesting to have, I don't know if you're a member of APPE, to join that, and that might be a really good medium. Also, the Online Ethics Center is starting something called Communities of Practice, and these are specifically, targeted for people in STEM education and responsible conduct of research education, and that might be another place. I know those communities are being worked on, and they're going to be up shortly, but this might be a way to continue to share what we're doing, what's working, what's not working, thinking about ways we could apply some of our pedagogical approaches in different contexts, and that might help. It doesn't break us out of the academe, but it's definitely a potential area for collaboration and kind of growing that community a little bit more in the future. So I'd be happy to share that information with everyone once the communities of practice are up.
Be great. Great. Eric, anything? Thoughts?
I don't have much more to add. I think this was a great panel. I like hearing the practical. As a chair of a biomedical engineering and chemical engineering program, seeing what people are doing is really fantastic. I do think probably one thing we could think about is how do we get this out, not outside of academia, but maybe to the populations that I deal with all the time. How do we get it to the departments, or maybe working with ABET to some extent? Somebody brought up accreditation, I think Becky did, about, people just check the boxes, but there is interest. It's a matter of, I'm on the other side of it, where I'm constantly telling people, department chairs and others, that, there's people that study all this that know how to do it well, which is many of the people on this call. And we just go about kind of clumsily not doing it well. Right. And so how do we bring those two parties together? Right. Is something we could do a lot of this much more effectively in the engineering side, or that's my side, obviously, if we worked across these disciplines more. But Kelly, and we've been doing this for a while, and Elizabeth, in many different and it's difficult, but it's seeing what others are doing and hearing this is great. So I'm all for trying to find ways to get these, the practical aspects together to talk about it. It's been really great.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So Elizabeth, you're going to take us out, and
No, I should formally end this and
the survey.
Sorry, why don't you do this, Chris?
Okay, we have put together a very brief survey, which we will be sending out, right, Kelly? We're going to send it out by email to all the people, not only panelists, but all the participants. And we would certainly appreciate you taking just a few minutes to fill that out. Yeah.
Yeah, looks like that's all we can do. We can just again thank all of you and wish you a wonderful afternoon, evening, night, whatever it is. I think for most of us, it's the afternoon and evening. And yeah, thank you, everyone. And
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you. This was really enjoyable. And the survey link is in the chat. So please take some time. Let us know what you think. And we look forward to hopefully working with you in the future.
That'd be great.
yeah.
Excellent. Great stuff. Thank you.